Today we are going to begin our section on identity, and we'll be covering topics related to the self, identity, and social identity. But before we get started, some quick updates and reminders. Quiz 2 is graded. Most of Activity 2 is graded with comments, so check that out. And if your Activity 2 has not yet been graded, it will be graded by Wednesday. Your Activity 3 is due Friday at 11:59 p.m. And this week, make sure to watch the supplementary videos. I pulled them. They're from psychology, but I think they cover a lot of important topics that we will be discussing this week and next week. And finally, begin reading the assignment for the assigned reading for next week. It's a bit long. It's not incredibly long, but it is a little bit lengthy, so make sure you go ahead and get started. Okay, so we will be, in this section of the lecture, we'll be discussing identity theory. And it's important to note that identity theory is separate from social identity theory. And all of these have to do with the self and the mind and some of the other concepts that we've discussed previously. But identity theory is one thing and social identity is another thing. So we'll go ahead and discuss some of the central concepts to identity theory. And so relating back to our section on symbolic interaction, and one of the major critiques for symbolic interaction was its lack of attention to social structure. And the answer to that was like impression management. And this is how society remains stable over time and how we're socialized into society. And so identity theory grew out of that, particularly more of the structural, that focus on structure and symbolic interaction. So that response to the major critique, which was a lack of focus on social structure, a lot of symbolic interactionists began focusing more on social structure, and this is where identity theory emerged. And so in his interpretation of Mead, Bloomer coined the term symbolic interaction, or the idea that individuals are unique and that they interact using symbols to communicate. The mind-self interaction, symbols and signs, and meaning are important in understanding what identity is, how it emerges, and how it is maintained within the individual and across situations. Within the mind is where our perceptions are formed as we interact with others and society. In identity theory, the meanings we give to ourselves exist in the mind, and these meanings are identity standards. So they're referred to as identity standards, which are the meanings we give to ourselves when we claim identities, whether they be group identities, role identities, or person identities. And the mind is actually the mechanism that controls meaning, which is indicated to the self and then shared with others. So again, as we're reviewing these concepts, we're specifically reviewing them from the perspective of identity theory, which has origins in symbolic interaction. So a lot of these you're going to be familiar with, but we're discussing them specifically from an identity theory perspective. And so from this perspective, the self grows out of the mind when the mind is able to look at itself as an object. So for those of you who are psychology majors, we know that there are these stages of development, and one of the most critical is when you reach the ability to take on the perspective of other people. And I believe one of the famous examples here is and it's kind of an odd example to explain, but there's a fake mountain. It's not very big, it's on a table, and a round table, and there's a little toy mountain goat on one side. And they take a little kid, and the kid looks on the side where there's nothing, it's just the mountain, and then moves to the other side where there's this little toy mountain goat. And they ask the kid, what is the other person on the side seeing? What do they see? And they'll say, they'll say the goat, even though they know that they were just over there and there wasn't a goat, right? But that has to do with like object permanence and the ability to take on the perspective of other people. And there's a lot of other examples, but it comes down to the self. From this perspective, from an identity theory perspective, the self grows out of the mind at the point when the mind has the ability to look at itself as an object. So taking on the perspective of others, but also that metacognition. When you're aware that you are thinking, that you are a person, that you have a self, and that the world is shaping you, and that you do have some control within that. And when we are reflexive, so when we think of ourselves, our own position, our own perspective, when we're reflexive, the response is from the point of view of others. So from this perspective, we're not necessarily seeing ourselves from ourselves or seeing ourselves through the eyes of others, because that's how we learn to understand ourselves. And by taking the role of the other and seeing the self as others do, there becomes this merger of perceptions on the self. And so again, that kind of relates back to when we were saying that individual behavior is group behavior. And so when you take on the perspective of others, when you view the self, like viewing yourself and your perceptions of yourself is at the same time taking on the view of others. And each self has slightly different constellation of meanings, which we'll get into here in a little bit about our multiple selves, so to speak. But each one has these different meanings attached to it. So you have, like, let's say a student identity versus a friend identity. Each of those has very different meanings and varies across context and time and the people you're with and place and so on. And then, whoops, I need to change that slide. I'll change that before I upload it. Should not say meet the team. It should just say signs and symbols. But this is really important here. So when we're talking about identity and what that relates to and how we construct our identities and how we view ourselves and others, symbols and signs are important terms here. And so we've talked about symbols and symbolization and meaning and all of that. But specifically when we're talking about identity theory, we are talking about symbols, which are an arbitrary association between a stimulus and response. So, for example, wearing a ring to symbolize commitment. And anything could represent commitment, but it's through socialization and social consensus that we learn to make these associations. So we've learned to associate like a wedding ring with commitment and with all of these other things, but it's really arbitrary. It could be anything. You could wear a necklace instead of a ring. You could get a tattoo instead of a ring, whatever the case may be, but it's arbitrary. Whereas a sign is non-arbitrary. It's a non-arbitrary association between a stimulus and a response. So language, for example, is a powerful set of responses, a powerful set of symbols, right? So language is a powerful set of symbols because it's through words that we communicate our thoughts and perceptions and all those different constellation of meaning. But a sign, because it's non-arbitrary, an example of that might be blushing. So blushing is a sign of embarrassment. It's not arbitrary because often people blush when they're embarrassed. And so there's a lot more meaning inherent to that sign than there are in symbols like a wedding ring for commitment. And then social interaction. So in social interaction, people use signs and symbols to make sense of each other and the situation, that is, to find meaning. And so finding meaning is possible by each taking the role of the other in an interaction so that there is shared understanding of the situation, making coordinated behavior possible. We should think of interaction not so much as individuals communicating with each other as whole persons, but as individuals communicating with particular selves or identities that are currently activated in a situation. since multiple selves or identities of the self is communicating with others at any one time. So that means in different situations we're going to activate different selves or different identities within those interactions after we've defined the situation. And so we are using these signs and symbols to make sense of each other. And those signs and symbols are part of who we are part of the self, are part of our identities. So like a wedding ring is a symbol of commitment, but it's also part of your identity as somebody's partner. In meaning, in an identity theory perspective, it still has very much a central role in interaction for identities. It emerges when a symbol calls forth a response that is the same for oneself and others. And characteristics of this are that in identity theory, meaning mediates the initial perception of a stimulus and one's subsequent response. When the self is the stimulus, and this part is pretty critical. When the self is the stimulus, meanings emerge that characterize oneself. So think of like an example of like a hardworking student, attentive neighbor, a risk taker. These characterizations of themselves in the student role identity and the attentive neighbor identity, the protective parent, the risk taker identity, these are what make up their identity standards and these different identities. So for these identities and their corresponding self-meanings to be activated in a situation, the self-meanings must be relevant to the situation. So for example, a hardworking student, that identity, it's more likely to be activated in a classroom than at a party. And thus, these must be there must be this correspondence between identity meanings and situational meanings. So moving on, discussing interaction and society. So again, we're looking at these terms and these concepts from an identity theory perspective, although you're already familiar with them. So when we discuss society and the interactions that occur on the micro level and our interactions with these greater societal forces, social interaction occurs within context of a complex and organized society made up of social structures. While social structures emerge out of individual behaviors that become patterned across persons and over time, it is also true that social structures affect the likelihood that persons located within them will evolve specific types of selves and identities. And this is consistent with society shaping the self, which in turn shapes behavior. And so what this is referring to is, again, our social interaction is not just occurring in a vacuum. It's occurring within these complex structures in society. And because we are all located in different places within the social structure based on our identities, whether it be like as a student, a daughter, a son, a friend, maybe, a religious person, or, whatever the case may be, you're located in different places within this social structure. And so when it says that social structures affect the likelihood that persons located within them will evolve specific kinds of selves or identities, that's like if you're born in the United States, specifically in this part of the country, where you're located in your family's background, your socioeconomic status, geographically where you're located in the country, and so on, and the people that you're interacting with, you might be more likely to evolve specific kinds of selves or identities like that of a Christian. I think specifically in this part of the country, probably Protestant. And so that's like one example of how a social structure will help evolve specific kinds of selves and identities. And there's this reciprocal relationship between the individual and society. So, right, individuals are maintaining society and shaping society, but society is also shaping individuals and shaping groups. And so moving on to the second part of this, an overview of identity theory. So identity theory has developed along two parallel lines. There is an internal subjective focus as well as an external social structural focus. The internal and external world are interdependent, and we will discuss how a single identity operates in a situation. Here, the internal subjective focus is clear. However, any identity exists within a situation and within a social structure, and here the external focus can be seen. Further, we will analyze multiple identities within a person. We will see that since multiple identities may be connected to different social networks and social structures, the external social structural focus is even clearer. And so this is a quick overview of identity theory, and Wednesday we will do it the same, something very similar to this for social identity theory. And then moving on into next week, we'll discuss how these can be applied, and we'll use examples and compare and contrast so that you can get a better idea of what these are and their utility in research, but also in your everyday life. So identities are embedded within situations such as the classroom for the student identity and the larger society like the educational system. So again, like having this identity as a student, you're embedded within these different situations such as the classroom, but also you're existing within larger society. So that larger structure instead of the classroom would be like the educational system as a whole. And so an identity is a set of meanings that a person applies to themselves. And some characteristics, like I said, you're embedded within these situations, such as with the student identity, in the classroom, and the educational system. And it's activated in a situation when identity meanings correspond to situational meanings. And so that means that identities become activated in a situation when the meanings in one's identity correspond to the relevant dimensions of meanings in a situation. And when there's little discrepancy between how we behave, how others react, and how we conceive of ourselves, there is identity verification. And if there is a lot of discrepancy there, it's identity non-verification. And if identity verification does not occur, two strategies will be employed. One is the person will increase attempts to gain identity verification, or they will alter their behavior to align more so with others' reaction, and that will begin shifting their identity. But if someone's identity isn't verified, so if people are like, if you say I'm a hardworking student, but you're being treated like you're someone who's lazy and not attentive to details and doesn't know much about, the world and things, you might try even harder to get people to acknowledge that. Or you might just begin to behave in a way that is more aligned with how you're being treated. And that may, not always, but it may begin to shape how you see yourself. And so going into that, individuals have multiple identities. That says that individuals are tied to multiple roles, groups, organizations, and networks. So there's all different types of identities. Like there's role identities, being one that I'm sure many of you have heard of. And there's personal identities and so on. But you're a part of all these different groups. You're a part of a family, you're a part of a friend group, you're a part of a university, you're a part of a class. And each of those carries different identities. And when we look at these broader social structures like race, class, gender, religion, and so on, you're also a part of different groups within those aspects of social structure. And so it creates these multiple identities within one person. And individuals may have the same role identities within different groups. And so, for example, people may have a friend identity in non-overlapping groups, like a work group, a school group, or a sports team. And then individuals may have different role identities within intersecting groups. So, for example, if you're visiting a friend's home while her parents are over, That friend, for her, that friend identity is activated, but also the daughter identity is being activated. So it's within these intersecting groups. And so this brings us to identity salience. And so identity salience is the readiness to invoke an identity across situations. So that means, again, going back to the hardworking student example, it would be a particularly salient identity if you are invoking that identity and all the things, many of the things associated with it on a more regular basis and across situations. So not just in the classroom, but maybe at work. You're like, I am a lifelong learner. I am a diligent student. I'm going to take that same approach in the workplace or within your family or friend group or, extracurricular organizations. So the more salient an identity, the more likely it is that it will be brought into a situation. However, some situations provide little opportunity to choose. So let's say, for example, in the classroom. Let's say you're also a parent and you're in the classroom, but it doesn't necessarily provide a lot of opportunities for you to invoke your identity as a parent within the classroom. Of course, there are some opportunities, maybe to comment on different things. You're seeing something in relation to that identity, but there's not necessarily a lot of opportunities to invoke that identity and those behaviors associated with it and all of those meanings in a classroom or at work or whatever the case may be. And the relative level of salience across identities makes up a person's identity salience hierarchy. And that's something we will keep discussing throughout this section, is identity salience and the identity salience hierarchy. So if you wanted to, you could make a list of all these different identities, these different roles you have. Again, going back to those macro structures like race, class, gender, religion, and so on. And all the ways in which you think of yourself in relation to others, in relation to society, or just things that you think you are, like hardworking or kind, smart, whatever the case may be. You could make a list of all of these things and rank them in some way. And then you could think about different situations like, in the classroom versus at a party versus at home with your family, that you're going to invoke different identities. Like if you had to rank them across these situations, they're going to be ranked a little bit differently. So identity salience. When we talk about identity salience, there's two forms of commitment. And by commitment, that means like you're committed to that identity, that it is very much a part of your identity salience hierarchy. It's something that is very much a part of who you are. And there's two forms of commitment we're going to discuss, which is interactional commitment and effective commitment. So when stronger commitment means having a larger number of persons to whom one is tied based on an identity, whereas effective commitment, when we say stronger commitment, means having deeper ties with those people who one is tied to based on an identity. So for interactional commitment, let's say that like there's a lot of people, like a big portion of people that you're interacting with are associated with this identity. So an example is like, I'm in grad school and most of the time all I'm doing is working. I'm working and I'm doing school and I'm teaching and that's it. And even though I do get to go home sometimes, or I do get to see friends, for the most part, most of the people I'm interacting with on a day-to-day basis are associated with the university and associated with my role as a student. So a lot of times we're talking about things that are related to that identity. And that means that I'm invoking that identity more often and it's higher up in my identity salience hierarchy. When it gets to effective commitment, it means if you have like these deeper ties with people who share this identity with. So let's say we could use like religion as an example. Even if you don't know a ton of people who are, let's say, Catholic, but you're Catholic and you do have a small group of people, maybe it's family, friends, acquaintances, whatever the case may be, but you have really strong ties with them. You have more intimate and personal relationships with them. And so that might mean that this particular identity is something that's much more, it's very important to you, it's a big part of who you are, even though you're not invoking it on a regular basis like you are maybe the student identity. It's something that you don't invoke a lot across situations, but it is very much a part of your identity salience hierarchy. And it's because of those deep, more intimate ties. Whereas interactional commitment is more of like a greater number. So like quantity versus quality of ties. And so in summary, we can bring together the hierarchical control system of identities that was discussed earlier with the idea of rank ordering of one's identities in terms of salience and the social structures within which these identities are embedded. So assuming the meanings in a situation and the interactional dynamics operate as a feedback loop, if the identity is not verified and repeated attempts to verify it occur to no avail, the identity over time may become less salient relative to other identities in the hierarchy. Individuals then may abandon these non-verified identities altogether, moving them out of those social structures that help shape them. And so that's an important point. So when we enter situations, we are more likely to activate these salient identities. And that's, again, assuming that the meanings in that identity match the meanings in the situation. But if our identity in that situation is not verified, we're going to often make attempts for it to be verified, or we'll then kind of abandon those attempts and abandon that identity altogether, or at least to some large extent. And so because of that, it'll move us out of those same social structures that shape them. So let's say you decide to abandon your identity as someone who's religious, so you're no longer attending, and because of that, you're no longer attending church, you're no longer consuming media that discusses those, religious doctrine and so on, and you're not going to church, you're not going to church groups or whatever the case may be, so you're moving out of those structures that helped shape that identity in the first place. But other than that, that's all. Make sure that you complete Activity 3, begin reading for next week, and watch the supplementary videos.